Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson, and the Nightlight is on for Thursday, February 29th, 2024. Lots to talk about today, particularly Alabama's ruling on in vitro fertilization. Americans say they are very concerned about the future of extremism. I think this ruling exemplifies a particular kind of extremism that we don't talk enough about. I want to break down Christian nationalism and one particular passage in the Bible that proves that this kind of nationalism ain't Christian at all. Plus, I saw a piece about Washington, D.C. being the loneliest city in the country. We should talk about loneliness for a minute. Be sure to go to nightlightjoshua.com to check out all the links to my social, to buy some merch, and maybe put a few bucks in the online tip jar. Well, it is the last day of the month. Good to be with you. Good to see everybody on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and the site formerly known as Twitter, now known as X. For those of you who are watching over on X, please know that I do take questions and comments in the chat, but unfortunately, X's software isn't compatible with my software. So if you want to be part of the same show and include your questions and thoughts, you can go over to my YouTube channel, which is Nightlight Joshua, youtube.com/@ you need both symbols, /@ Nightlight Joshua, where you can take part in the live chat, where there are some lovely people there already. Some of our frequent flyers, including Nora. Hello, Nora. Glad you liked the nice light jazz music that I played before the show. Sarah, hello. Good to be with you. Glad you're on time today, young lady. Don't think I didn't see you sneak in the back of the class yesterday. Welcome, Sarah. Good to see you again. Joseph, hello. Happy Friday Eve to you as well. Solange checks in. Present. Hello, Solange. Good to see you. Abby Weiss, good to see you, and happy Leap Day to you as well. Abby, forgive me. I don't think I've seen you in the chat before, but regardless of whether you've been watching and are just chatting and maybe I just didn't notice it, welcome. Glad to have you here today. Pleased to be with you today. Looking forward to a great show. I have been working on getting the next version of this program together. As some of you know, the show's going to be moving to nighttime next week. So that's been fun. I think I've been really enjoying the prospect of getting better sleep. Can we just talk about sleep for a second? I have realized how much of my life is wrapped around getting enough sleep to do this thing rather than doing this thing around my sleep. And I think that working for myself now, as difficult as it is kind of a blessing in that I get to pick my sleep schedule. So it'll be nice to not kind of anticipate my alarm because I've only got a few hours to put the show together. Instead, I'll be able to put it together in a much healthier way. So win one for our side. Score one for restfulness. Score one for wakefulness too, not relying quite so much on caffeine, which I still love. By the way, one of our favorite items here in our apartment, for those of you who don't know, this is just the second bedroom of my apartment where I'm doing the show. This is my studio. But one of the favorite things in our apartment that we bought in the last few months, and I don't know if anybody else is like this other than me, is our espresso machine. Oh my God, I'm so glad I know how to make espresso now. I wasn't much of an espresso drinker until I learned how to make it. And now I'm like, oh, Bustelo is a gift from the little baby Jesus. This is one of the most wonderful things I've ever had in my whole life. And now I can kind of make it the way I want it, get the day started, and save a fortune on coffee. Nothing against Dunkin', but Lord Jesus, it's a little much. So that part of it, I think, is going to be healthier. We'll talk more about sleep on this show, too. I think that's a quality of life issue that doesn't get discussed nearly enough, is the way we sleep and how much we sleep and the quality of our sleep. That is an issue that I think we need to talk about, but we will get to that. Also, happy birthday to those of you who are celebrating your birthday only once every 4 years. There are a number of leaplings in the world whose birthday falls on February 29th and thus is not actually marked except every 4 years. Nora, I see that you have a young friend who turns 8 today, or 32, depending on how you count. He's 32. Could you imagine walking into the DMV as a 64-year-old man and saying, I'm finally old enough to take the test, and they just look at you like, you were born on February 20. I was born on February 20. Yeah, we get it, sir. We get it. Abby says, oh, your cousin's son also is having a birthday today, turns 2 or 8, depending on how you look at it. Well, happy birthday, Leaplings. We appreciate you being here and aging so much slower than the rest of us. You lucky sons of guns. Let's dive into today's topic. It is something that has me really quite concerned. And it's a bit of a deep dive, which is what we do here, right? That's kind of what the show is built for. But it's a deep dive about something that I've talked about on the show before, but also something that has me very troubled, but also kind of hopeful. And it's sort of a two-parter in a way, because tomorrow we're going to be running an interview that I taped with, well, one of the more interesting evangelical campaigns in the country. And I'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. If you are concerned about extremism in America, you must be paying attention to the ruling out of Alabama regarding in vitro fertilization. That ruling says more about extremism than you might think. And it's something that I want to explain to you so you know what you're looking at. It's not just enough to say Christians want to take over the country and they just want everyone to be Christian. There's more to it for some Christians, a subset of Christians. And I want to be clear, the data we have, and I'll show you the data in just a second, but the data we have suggests that this is still a subset of Christianity. One of the things I don't like about discussions of evangelical Christianity is the tendency that many of us have to just paint all evangelicals or all Christians with the same broad brush. That is not fair. There is a much more nuanced and frankly useful way to talk about this that I want to get into. So I just want to set up at the very beginning. This is not about dumping on Christians or dumping on evangelicals. I was raised Christian, and I know my Bible pretty well, and I'll try to prove it to you in a second. I pulled one or two verses that I think are useful, but I don't want this to just be about Christianity. Indeed, I don't believe that what we're going to talk about today is actually Christian. I'm going to put it out there right off the top. I think there are a lot of people out there who call themselves Christians, but they are not behaving in a Christ-like way. And I'm going to explain why coming up. I know that this is risky ground to tread on for a program that deals with current events, but we did not ask for Christianity to be infused this heavily into secular politics. A small subset of Christians chose this. They brought the fight. So game on. Gloves are on. Ring the bell, round one. We know, at least from the latest survey data, that Americans are concerned about this. There was a Reuters Ipsos poll that came out just 2 days ago about the concerns over political extremism. I find this really remarkable, partly because most polling, when you ask voters, well, what's your primary concern for this election? Most voters will say the economy, whatever the economy is to you, right? Retirement or the stock market or buying groceries or paying rent. Economy could mean anything. But in a poll that Reuters and Ipsos did just last week, where they released the results this week, the largest group within that in terms of the concerns was not economy. 19% said economy, 18% said immigration, 21% said political extremism or threats to democracy. That was what they said was their number one concern right now heading into the presidential election. The Reuters poll also found that Democrats considered extremism by far the number one issue. Republicans overwhelmingly chose immigration. But among independents, who are and have long been the largest slice of the electorate, extremism was their top concern. Almost a third of people who describe themselves as political independents said extremism, then immigration, and then the economy. So that might show a bit of a split in terms of where independent voters are leaning. I would pay very, very close attention to how independents lean, because independents often make elections happen. But yeah, extremism is definitely something that we're talking about, and if you are concerned about it, you are absolutely not the only one, particularly after this ruling in Alabama. For those of you who may not know or only kind of heard it halfway, Alabama's state Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court, the Alabama State Supreme Court, ruled that frozen embryos should be considered children, and that people who allow them to be destroyed, who allow the embryos to be destroyed or to come to harm, could be held legally responsible for that. Essentially, it's the same principle as if I ran a daycare in Huntsville and a child at my daycare, God forbid, a car came around the corner and injured that child. I'm responsible for the welfare of that child because that child is in my care. This would treat embryos in vitro fertilization facilities the same way under Alabama's state law and under Alabama's Constitution. We're going to take a look at Alabama's Constitution in just a second, but that is what this ruling is about. The ruling came out about a week and a half ago now, on Friday, February 16th, and it has to do with an IVF clinic in Mobile, Alabama. There were 3 couples who had already done business with this clinic, but some of their other frozen embryos got destroyed. We'll get into that as well, because that's a huge factor in this story. Some of their frozen embryos got destroyed, and so they sued the clinic, and the back and forth was about whether or not the clinic could be held legally responsible under a state statute. And the statute is not about embryos. It's a broader statute about child protection and child endangerment, which they sued over. This move has already had some pretty intense impacts. In the state of Alabama, the University of Alabama at Birmingham Health System, which is a very large health system, kind of a hospital system right smack in downtown Birmingham, announced that it's pausing IVF treatments while they figure out what the law is. This is very similar to what happened after Dobbs versus Jackson in 2022. That's the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that struck down Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where you had a bunch of clinics who were like, we're not going to do anything for a while because we don't know what the law is anymore. Same thing with IVF in Alabama. You also had 2 more facilities, the Alabama Fertility Services and the Center for Reproductive Medicine at Mobile Infirmary, who announced they were going to do the same. Mobile Infirmary is one of the players in this Alabama case, and they're going to become their character in the story. We'll get to that in just a second. There's a piece I found from Boston University that talks about IVF, and maybe some of you have had experiences with IVF. If so, feel free to share them in the chat. You don't have to share any information that's sensitive. Please don't share anything that's medically privileged. That's your private information, and this is a public chat. I cannot ensure your privacy in that regard. But if you are willing to share any of it, I'll listen. I'd be happy to know what your experience was. But according to this piece from Boston University, it describes IVF as emotionally and physically exhausting. There are multiple eggs that are harvested from a person's ovaries. They're fertilized with sperm externally, implanted in the uterus to create a pregnancy. And often, in most cases, doctors will create more embryos than they implant, partly so that the additional embryos can be stored. About 2% of infants nationwide, according to the CDC, just over 2% of all infants are conceived using IVF or some other kind of method known as assisted reproductive technology, ART. And the latest data we have shows that about a quarter of all ART cycles resulted in a live birth. About half of them were for banking the embryos, putting them in kind of a facility and freezing embryos. So that's kind of the lay of the land of this overall. This measure in Alabama prompted a quick kickback from the U.S. Congress. The Senate tried to put forth a bill that would advance a measure to protect IVF nationwide. Senator Tammy Duckworth, who's a Democrat from Illinois, asked for the Senate to pass the measure by unanimous consent. Now, unanimous consent just means, hey, I've got a bill. Any objections? No? Good, it's passed. And unanimous consent is normal. This is not a weird, secret, backhanded tactic. It's used all the time in many parliamentary procedural processes. So it's not a weird way to go. That was blocked by a Republican senator from Mississippi, Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith. According to the Washington Post, Senator Hyde-Smith called Senator Duckworth's bill a vast overreach that goes, in her words, way too far. She claimed that she is in favor of total access to IVF, and Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith also downplayed the impact of Alabama's decision, saying that it did not ban IVF. That's kind of true, sort of. It doesn't ban IVF outright. It just makes IVF functionally almost impossible to do. So it basically bans it. I mean, it doesn't say that facilities have to shut down, but it does raise the bar dramatically for the work of IVF. And I'll get into that in just one second. It's a distinction without a difference, I think. It's a distinction without a difference. One of the things I'd like you to see is what the actual ruling is and how the actual ruling kind of came down. And then we'll get a little deeper into some of these other pieces of this. Now, the ruling, first of all, was written not by Alabama's Chief Justice, Tom Parker, but he's become a major character in this. Tom Parker wrote a concurring opinion that basically affirms the opinion of the court, but adds additional materials to it. So when you hear about the Alabama IVF debate and when you hear about the issues of Christian theology being woven into this, understand that it didn't come from the core opinion of the court. It came from a concurring opinion, but it was written by the Chief Justice, the concurrence. So it still carries a lot of weight. It's a detail that's important for a few reasons, one of which is the fact that Alabama is going to the polls this year to elect a new Chief Justice. So this issue is pertinent. Also, Tom Parker is ineligible to run again. Alabama has a rule that anyone who is over the age of 70 cannot run for re-election for this office. I find that a fascinating rule. We will debate that some other time. But Alabama has decided that for this role, you cannot run again or run at all if you are or will be 70 when you assume the job. Tom Parker will be 70. He can't run again. And so there's a new slate of candidates. So this will be an issue when Alabamians go to the polls on Super Tuesday. This is another Super Tuesday race to pay attention to. I know we've got too many. This is another Super Tuesday race to pay attention to in Alabama because it's directly connected to some of these other cultural issues. And there's big money coming in from other states, from huge national organizations, including conservative and religious organizations, to influence the race for Alabama's Chief Justice. And it's a job that turns over a lot. Oddly enough, it's not like John Roberts where you get the job and keep it for, until you turn to dust. This job seems to turn over a lot. So Alabamians do vote on this. They do pay attention to this. And if they weren't paying attention, they're definitely paying attention now. I want to show you Chief Justice Parker's concurring opinion in this ruling. It is problematic from the jump, and it is problematic further in, and we'll get to that in just a second. But take a look at his ruling. From the very beginning, I sound like Baymax from Big Hero 6. I have some concerns. Take a look at the very beginning of Chief Justice Parker's ruling, or his concurring opinion. It begins, quote, "A good judge follows the Constitution instead of policy, except when the Constitution itself commands the judge to follow a certain policy. In these cases, that means upholding the sanctity of unborn life, including unborn life that exists outside the womb." Unquote. Pause right there. So from the beginning of his concurrence, Justice Parker makes it clear that he is not fully allegiant to the Constitution. That's what he just said. A good judge follows the Constitution instead of policy, except, wait, except? What? How is there an exception to being constitutional in a ruling of a Supreme Court? From the jump, his concurrence is a problem. Continuing. Quote, "Our state constitution contains the following declaration of public policy. This state acknowledges, declares, and affirms that it is the public policy of this state to recognize and support the sanctity of unborn life and the rights of unborn children, including the right to life." And then from there, he goes on to kind of define sanctity, and he looks at it in the dictionary and what it means in common law and all that kind of thing. Now, those kinds of references are not inherently unusual. They're not inherently problematic in terms of the ways in which courts do what they do. Sometimes looking at common law or the plain meaning of a word can be useful. What he doesn't really do is allow his ruling to rely on secular sources. He very quickly goes to religious sources. We'll see why he does that momentarily. But as he works his way further down, the issues begin to emerge. For one thing, he notes that he notes the dictionary definition of what sanctity is, or what it was at least at the time that this measure was adopted. And he cites the definition that comes from Merriam-Webster. Merriam-Webster defines sanctity. It's a noun. Sanctity means holiness of life and character. Synonym, godliness. Second definition, the quality or state of being holy or sacred. Also, inviolability. So he notes, and I think he notes rightly, actually, that advocates of such policies use the word sanctity specifically. They could have said any number of other words, but they chose a word that has a specific spiritual connotation to it. I think that's actually a very useful point, and I think it is well made. Whether you agree with it or not is your business, but I think that the language itself, your words have power, and I think people picked that word because it has a lot of power emotionally and theologically for them. Further down comes the part of his concurrence that actually, and he makes references to the Ten Commandments and Bible verses and John Calvin, who is a theological, leader. He makes a lot of religious references in his concurrence, which is kind of remarkable. But the issue, I think, that a lot of people keyed into was what he wrote in the conclusion to his ruling. Here's the way he put it in the conclusion to his concurrence. Quote, "The people of Alabama have declared the public policy of this state to be that unborn human life is sacred. We believe that each human being from the moment of conception is made in the image of God, created by him to reflect his likeness. It is as if the people of Alabama took what was spoken of the prophet Jeremiah and applied it to every unborn person in this state. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you." That's Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. Continuing to quote, "All three branches of government are subject to a constitutional mandate to treat each unborn human life with reverence. Carving out an exception for the people in this case, small as they were, would be unacceptable to the people of this state, who have required us to treat every human being in accordance with the fear of a holy God who made them in his image. For these reasons, and for the reasons stated in the main opinion, I concur." Unquote. That is the part that caused all this uproar in Alabama. References to a holy God, Bible verses, and just the overall theological view of a Supreme Court ruling. A state Supreme Court ruling, yes, but a ruling that is meant to interpret the state's constitution. Granted, every state has to interpret its individual constitution in light of the U.S. Constitution. So these are clearly in conflict. This is not okay. This is not the way the law is supposed to work. The First Amendment gives us freedom of religion. It also gives us freedom from religion. You're not required to be religious under the First Amendment, nor are you required to agree, nor are you required to associate with under the First Amendment. This is highly problematic, as I think most people realize. And it is most people who realize this. There was a study that came out just yesterday from a very well-known research organization called PRRI that does a lot of research on America's religious views and on the ways in which Americans define and describe their faith, particularly Christianity. They don't do as much research on Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or anything else, Judaism. It's mostly research on Americans who define themselves as Christian. And they just put out a study this week about support for Christian nationalism across the country. We're going to define this in just a second. Well, actually, let's define it here because they define it in their study. But what they note is that in their study, about 3 in 10 Americans identify as either adherents or sympathizers of Christian nationalism. Adherent meaning yes, I am a Christian nationalist. Sympathizer meaning I'm not really, but I support it. I get it. I believe it. The smallest sliver of that were the adherents, 10%. That would be 1 in 10. That's a lot of people. The U.S. population is about 340 some odd million. That's 34 million people. That is enough to populate the state of California like almost twice. With 34 million people, you could almost populate the state of California because California is about 39 million. That's a lot of people. Lord Jesus. 2/3 of Americans define themselves as skeptics or rejectors of Christian nationalism. And again, this is people who define themselves as Christian nationalists, not Christian. The overwhelming majority of Americans say they have some kind of a relationship with what we would define as Christianity. Very, very few define themselves as Christian nationalists. It's also worth noting, according to PRRI, these percentages have pretty much held flat since they began polling on this in 2022. And also, if you look further down in the study, the relationship in terms of which of those groups is first, second, third, and fourth, that has remained also very consistent since this started. So it's not as if, Christian nationalism is necessarily rising. It's just that we have a clearer picture of it now. The states with the highest support for Christian nationalism, Alabama is definitely up there. The largest among those who have adherents and sympathizers, North Dakota and Mississippi are tied for first with 50%. Alabama and West Virginia would be tied for third with 47%. Louisiana is right behind it at fifth at 46%. We're talking mostly about red states. Blue states have their proportion of Christian nationalists as well, so-called blue states, but not nearly as many. And by far, it's more likely among Republicans than Democrats, by far. Independents are kind of in the middle, about a quarter of independents versus half of people who define themselves as Republicans and half of people who say they support President Trump. So it's not particularly shocking. One thing, though, that I think is important to bear in mind is that there are Christians and then there are Christians and then there are Christians, right? If you are an Episcopalian, you are very different than, say, a Methodist, who is different than, say, a person who goes to a Calvary chapel, than someone who goes to Church of God in Christ, which is a black denomination, than someone who goes to, a Hispanic Nazarene church where the services are in Spanish, right? There are Christians and then there are, which is different from Jehovah's Witnesses, which are different from people who are part of Metropolitan Community Church, which ministers to LGBTQ people. There are Christians and then there are Christians. I think there's also a huge difference between black Christians and white Christians. Black evangelicals are much more driven by social justice and prosperity gospel. White evangelicals are driven much more by conservative politics and mechanisms of what you could broadly consider social control, right? Exerting God's will and making the rest of the world look like their interpretation of God's will. And it is very different between black and white. There are clear political differences. Back to the poll, white Christian nationalists, and there are black Christian nationalists, but white Christian nationalists are much more likely than black or Hispanic Christian nationalists to prioritize immigration and guns when they think about politics. They're also way more likely to say they trust Fox News or far-right television news sources to give them accurate information about current events and politics. So I want to be clear about what we're talking about. We're not talking about apples-to-apples Christians. There are differences in regions of the country, and there are enormous differences in race. Enormous. So we are mostly talking about white, rural Christian nationalists. Mostly. Not entirely, but mostly. Let's talk about the ones in Alabama and go back to this ruling. I want to tell you a little bit more about Tom Parker. I want to play you a clip of an interview that he gave around the time of this ruling to a site, to an organization called Restore 7. What's Restore 7 about? The description of Restore 7 on their website, and this is where we're going. I know this is a long lead up, but this is where we're going. Restore 7 describes itself as an organization that empowers individuals to restore an accurate perception of who God is to humanity. Reformers who express the love of God through practical solutions for every problem that exists in society. And then they list 7 of them: media, family, arts and entertainment, economy, education, religion, and government. Those 7 are vital to pay attention to. Those are known as the 7 mountains. And we will get to what the 7 mountains movement is in just a second. But I want to play you a clip of Alabama Chief Justice Tom Parker speaking to the host of this program, Restore 7, right around the time of this ruling, talking about his background as a conservative Christian and his relationship to the law kind of earlier in his career. Here is part of what Alabama Chief Justice Tom Parker said on the program Restore 7.
My heart was involved in the first wave of the religious liberty defense that swept this country. And it's interesting, I've never seen anything written about it, but all of a sudden, attorneys all across the country with no connection whatsoever were filing the same type cases for religious defense. And that had to be a move of the Holy Spirit.
That's approximately what years?
That was in the 80s.
Okay.
And out of that have risen major national religious defense organizations, religious universities, so many different organizations that did not exist at that time. It was just individual attorneys working at their call that they had after God had burdened their heart. And so I was involved in that. And through that, we got to meet each other eventually and form some very nice networks that have continued even until today.
Let me interrupt just a second. So religious defense, would that be about religious freedoms or pro-life or some combination?
It was religious freedoms was the emphasis at that time.
Because there was, in the 80s, there was a sense that it was being highly encroached upon in our nation. Is that would be why there's sort of a response from believers?
Well, at that point, we had a U.S. Supreme Court liberal-dominated majority that were really not even following the Constitution and trying to remove religion from society. And so there was a flashback against that was occurring through the Christian attorneys across the country.
So that's Tom Parker, the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, speaking on a program called Restore 7. The mountains that we're talking about, the 7 Mountains movement, this idea comes from the Bible. There's a passage in the book of Isaiah. It's chapter 2, verse 2. The New International Version says, "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it." That's from Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. This is a movement that is designed very explicitly to push into secular society a very conservative Christian theology in policy and in practice. I kind of like the way that NPR.org put it, some of their coverage of the fallout of all of this. 7 Mountains Mandate, which is what this is, urges adherents to establish what they consider to be God's kingdom on earth by taking control of 7 areas of society: family, religion, government, education, arts and entertainment, commerce, and media. They also note, rightly so, and this has come up a few times, that Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the U.S. House, has been very connected to a group called the New Apostolic Reformation Movement. The New Apostolic Reformation movement espouses 7 Mountain theology. So the idea that this is just kind of a fringe, or, these are people who want to have impact on our society and, they're still trying to kind of make their way, or this is what they're after. No, they are in positions of power right now. This is happening now. And I think if this is your religious view, you are completely entitled to believe whatever you want about religion. The issue is, how much should this be influencing our policy? And is this even Christian to begin with? When we come back, I want to get to some more of your questions and thoughts on this. I'd love to hear what you think, especially if you have had conversations with or debates with people who share this view. If you consider yourself a Christian nationalist, you are most welcome here. But I would love to understand what you believe. And I would love to understand why you believe it and what it would mean to you to have these 7 mountains, as it were, be claimed for Christ as you see it. I would welcome your point of view. So if that's how you feel, please know you're in a friendly space. We are nice people. We will not beat you up. I won't allow it. That's not how we roll. But I'd love to hear from you. If you're out there and listening, please share your thoughts in the chat. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about this, get deeper into some of the connections here, and also lay out a few biblical problems that I think this has. Plus, There's another person who is involved in this whole matter in Alabama at the IVF clinic whose story seems to have fallen off the radar. For the life of me, I can't figure it out. There's one other person that should have been prosecuted, and I don't know if they ever were. We'll get to all of that, and we'll get to your questions and thoughts when we come back. This is The Nightlight. I'm Joshua Johnson. Good to be with you today. Remember to go to nightlightjoshua.com for all of my social media links, to follow the show as a podcast. You can also get some Nightlight merch in our online store. There's an online tip jar if you enjoy what you see or hear on the show and want to show your support, keep the show going. You can put a few dollars in there. You can also contact me on that site and just check out all of the various things that are going on with me and stay in touch with the show. Also, you should know that this week is the last week for broadcasts at this time. I will still be streaming, but I'm moving the stream from daytime to nighttime. And I'm going to be streaming today. I'm going to experiment maybe with a couple different times, but I'm going to be streaming again today, or tonight rather, from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern time. That's 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific. So it's going to be the exact same show, the exact same content, hopefully a little better the second time around. We'll see. But it's going to be the exact same program to begin to establish the nighttime streams. As of this week, the daytime streams will go away, and it will simply be streaming at night. I will let you know about the finalized times for this show tomorrow, once I've got a little more data and once I've got everything worked out. But all of that information will also be available online at nightlightjoshua.com. One point that I did want to get to, Abby noted on YouTube, rightly so. Abby, thank you for catching this, because I meant to do this sooner. Abby wrote, "You said you were going to define Christian nationalism, but I may have missed it. Please repeat." Abby, you didn't miss it? I didn't say it. And I'm sorry I didn't say it. I should have said it sooner. Christian nationalism, I like the way that it was put. There was an interview with PBS NewsHour where Laura Barron Lopez interviewed Brad Onishi, who is a former evangelical minister who left the church and used to identify as Christian nationalist himself. He defined it this way, which I think is the simplest way to put it. Christian nationalism is an ideology that is based around the idea that this, America, that this is a Christian nation, that this was founded as a Christian nation, and therefore it should be a Christian nation today and should be so in the future. According to survey data, Christian nationalists agree with statements like the federal government should declare the United States of America a Christian nation. Our laws should be based on Christian values. Being Christian is important if you want to be a real American. So that's Christian nationalism. Now, the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation is challenging at best. Although the PRRI survey that I told you about, they ask about those very things. They define Christian nationalism in terms of how much people agree with the following 5 statements. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Laws should be based on Christian values. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. And then based on how people responded to those 5 questions, PRRI, the ones that did the survey about Christian nationalism I told you about earlier, they kind of assign a score, and that's how they determine whether people are adherents or sympathetic or skeptical or opponents. So that's kind of the basis of Christian nationalism. There are some key values in here that I think are worth calling out that make the Alabama IVF ruling stand out very differently. And it also speaks to why it's so important that Chief Justice Parker cited scripture inside the ruling. I mean, look at the way that this is phrased. And I think PRRI did it right. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Not just that America is a Christian nation, but that the U.S. government should say so. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. The third one in particular, if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Well, why wouldn't we have a country if the U.S. does not avowedly founded on Christianity? Simple answer, because God will take it from us. Because God has made us stewards of this country, and if we don't act in a manner that espouses these values, then we will lose it, and it will be God's judgment on us. That's kind of the undercurrent of this. We only keep this if we do things that way. And then the statement about being Christian being an important part of being truly American. Truly. So if you are not avowedly, proudly, vocally Christian, then you're not really an American. But that is a defining characteristic. So if you are Jewish, you don't count. If you are Muslim, if you are Hindu, if you are an atheist or agnostic, if you're questioning, if you're just not sure, you don't count as American. And then this idea that God called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. That is key. It is speaking to a desire to have deep impact and control, real lasting control, not just over an election or two, but forever. This would be kind of the end of democracy as we know it and as we see it in a very real way, not in one of those conspiracy theory ways. That is the point. Also, the idea of a mountain, the 7 mountains movement, is important. Matthew Taylor, who is a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, spoke to NPR, and one of the things he said kind of explains why it's a mountains movement. He says, quote, "The idea is that Christians are supposed to take power over society, and that influence flows down from the top of each mountain," unquote. So, Christians at the top running things, and it trickles down throughout society. Okay, that is immediately not biblical. That's very problematic. I seem to remember, I'm just looking it up now. Oh yes, there it is. I seem to remember a verse where some guy, I don't remember who he was, he might have had something to do with Christianity. Oh, that's right, Jesus. Said, Matthew chapter 23, verse 11 and 12, "The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." He also calls out the religious right of his day. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces." So how is Christian nationalism Christian? Jesus said, "The greatest among you will be your servant." Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Anyone can be great because anyone can serve." Serve. And Jesus was very clear about this desire to puff yourself up and make yourself look all big and bad because you're Christian. No. That's not what this is about. Jesus didn't pick you because you were the biggest and the strongest. He picked you because you were the smallest and the weakest. And he thought, if I can do something with them, I can do something with anybody. That's what I was taught, right? That's what I was taught growing up. That I wasn't picked, that we aren't picked or loved because of what we can do for God. We can't do anything for God that God can't do for himself. We're that special? Christian nationalists seem to think so. But I digress. Back to the programming. The impact of this is very, very specific. You might remember on January 6th, there was a minister who led a prayer early in that rally named Pastor Paula White. That minister, and this is a piece from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is very much connected to this 7 Mountain movement, the 7 Mountain mandate, who led this prayer, and among the biggest supporters of Donald Trump, one of the evangelical Christians who made it very clear that there is a need for people who have espoused this form of Christianity to take control of our society. And if you look at the ways in which Alabama's laws are written, it's pretty clear that there are some challenges. Now, I said we go back to the state constitution. Here it is. You can see, and this is in Article 1 of the Alabama State Constitution, Declaration of Rights. It's got a lot of different sections in it. The first one is called Equality and Rights of Men. Very first section. Sorry, I was just opening it up on my computer. First section, Section 1, Article 1, equality and rights of men, that all men are equally free and independent, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sorry, ladies, they haven't gotten around to you yet. Further down, Section 36.06, sanctity of unborn life. The state acknowledges, declares, and affirms that it is the public policy of the state to recognize and support the sanctity, there's that word, sanctity of unborn life and the rights of unborn children, including the right to life. The state further acknowledges, declares, and affirms that it is the public policy of the state to ensure the protection of the rights of the unborn child in all manners and measures lawful and appropriate. Nothing in this Constitution secures or protects a right to abortion or requires the funding of an abortion. The key here is that Alabama's state constitution does not define this as a matter of religion. It just says, this is our public policy. It's not a religious argument that's written into the Constitution. Though you might have noticed, if you're looking at my screen anyway, that a few sections above sanctity of unborn life is a section on the sanctity of marriage. And this section, as it's written, is unconstitutional because it says, no marriage license shall be issued in the state of Alabama to parties of the same sex. Yeah, they will, because they have to. This is unconstitutional. So the state of Alabama's got they have a lot of rewriting to do. I would not count on that happening anytime quickly. But how much more is there to this? I think there's another piece to this as well. In addition to the religious piece, there's a larger issue here that I don't quite understand, and I wish I did. One of the nice parts about reading Supreme Court rulings, no matter where they come from, is that at the beginning of the ruling, it lays out all the circumstances for how the case came to be this case. And I see that y'all have been chatting it up. I'm going to come back to some of your comments in the chat in just 1 second. So bear with me 1 second. But there's one more piece of this that just kind of like, I can't wrap my brain around it. How did we get to this point? Well, the ruling lays out the facts and procedural history of what led up to the ruling. It says the plaintiffs are the parents of a number of embryonic children, 3 couples in particular, James and Emily LePage, William Fond and Caroline Fond, and Felicia and Scott Asen. They are suing, or they sued over a number of their embryos that were destroyed. The Alabama State Supreme Court ruling notes that these parents have already had children through in vitro fertilization. So it's not that the parents oppose IVF. They used IVF. So just to be clear, that's not why this case was brought. This case was not brought to put an end to in vitro fertilization. It just may have that effect. Unintended, intended. But it notes that they went to a fertility clinic operated by the Center for Reproductive Medicine for IVF treatments. Doctors did help them conceive children, joined eggs and sperm in vitro, artificially gestated them to a few days, placed them in a cryogenic nursery, as it were, which is a facility, this phrase is in the ruling, to keep extrauterine embryos alive. Extrauterine? Embryos outside of the uterus, but that's a weird way to... Anyway. So, they put them in this cryogenic nursery. They did indeed create a number of embryos, some of which were implanted and resulted in healthy births. So again, they've used IVF before. And they agreed to have the remaining embryos kept in the center's cryogenic nursery, which was located in the same building as the Mobile Infirmary Medical Center, the hospital. Here's the key of what happened that I don't understand, and that makes this even wackier for me. According to the ruling, in December 2020, a patient at the hospital managed to wander into the center's fertility clinic through an unsecured doorway. The patient then entered the cryogenic nursery and removed several embryos. The sub-zero temperatures at which the embryos had been stored freeze-burned the patient's hand, causing the patient to drop the embryos on the floor, killing them. The plaintiffs brought 2 lawsuits against the center and the association. But what about the patient? What happened to the patient? Did they sue the patient who dropped their embryos? Did they go after them at all? Why did they leap directly to the medical center? I totally understand. We put you in care of something you should have had the door locked. We need like some kind of damages. I get that. But like the medical center may have been negligent, but the medical center wasn't the one who quote unquote killed the embryos. This patient did. I cannot find anywhere, and I'm sure there's an answer to this. I cannot find anywhere what happened to the patient who actually destroyed the embryos. Nothing. So this has become a larger issue about the entire future of in vitro fertilization, when perhaps it's really just a debate about locked doors. I am so confused. Anyway, isn't that remarkable? Isn't that kind of amazing? The intensity of the focus on the religious aspect of this and on the cultural aspect of this, which I understand, right? If you are a Christian, I can understand how you might be aggrieved at the state of the country and feel like it is your responsibility to turn America into a more Christ-like direction. I can empathize with that. I think in his way, Dr. King felt that. That was what motivated many of the black leaders in the civil rights movement. They believed that racism and discrimination and dehumanization were against God's will. That's why Dr. King did it. It just happened to line up perfectly with the U.S. Constitution in ways we had not yet enacted. That's why that movement was so righteous, because we realized, oh, we've got another reason to be the country we said we were on paper. And it made perfect sense. This does not make sense in line of the country that we are. We're not a country that ever strove to be a religious or a Christian nation. Think about what it meant to be Christian in the days of the founders. What was the Christian church to the founders? It was the Church of England. And who was the head of the Church of England? God? Jesus? Nope. The king. King George III. So for the founders, the church was the state. Because the state was the king. It was the monarchy. And he was so hip, even his arrows were correct. Everything King George III did, by definition, was an act ordained by God. So you can understand how if you live in that kind of a world, when you come to the Americas and realize that the world is different outside of the kingdom than the king says it is, your mind begins to open. And in that particular era of enlightenment, people began to say, this does not make sense. God gave me an entire brain and the king is telling me not to use it. So to the founders, religion was a very different thing. Christian meant something completely different than it does in an era of televangelists, right? And, you know, the pluralistic religious environment in which we live today. I mean, this was not that far removed from the era when people thought that Shylock from The Merchant of Venice was an accurate depiction of Jews. Like, there was a dramatically different view of God in the days of our founders. How can we make that connection to today? Logically, it does not make sense. It doesn't make sense. But Christian nationalists would have you believe that's exactly what their heads were about. That's where they were. That's what they wanted. They wanted that based on what? We weren't quite a world that had burst forth through the Protestant Reformation to the extent that it would throw off religious monarchies and religious monarchical governments. We weren't there yet until the United States did it first. And then it spread. So the whole historical basis for Christian nationalism is just bunk. It just does not hold up to the littlest bit of intellectual rigor. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. I think there are also theological reasons for it, but I'll get to that in a second. Before I do that, let me get back to the chat for just a moment and see what some of y'all have been talking about. Other than the fact that people have been celebrating leap birthdays. I saw that a little earlier in the chat and how you celebrate those birthdays. I think that's very cute. But other than that, let me look at some of your other comments in the chat. Sarah on YouTube writes, Regent University in my city set up with the express goal to put Christians in positions of power across America. They've been quite successful at it. Quite a few organizations have indeed been successful at that as well. Nora wrote, oh, sorry, you use an abbreviation. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. Nora wrote, I've been watching this narrative expand over the last couple of weeks, but somehow it never grapples with the positions of scholars on the topic. Instead, Christian nationalism seems to be a synonym for Trump-ish. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's a synonym for Trump-ish. I think it's kind of a shorthand for some of the people who we ascribe to Donald Trump's most allegiant bases. I honestly believe that to Donald Trump, Christian nationalists are what Vladimir Putin would call useful idiots. I don't believe that he shares those same views. He might share some of them, but I don't believe that he has the same fervor for them. I think he has a hunger for power, and I think that Christian nationalists also have a hunger for power. It's just for Christian nationalists, their view of power flows from their view of God. And for Donald Trump, his view of power flows from his view of himself. But they both yearn for power. And I always think about the words of John Adams. I'm telling you, the founders have wisdom if you know where to look. John Adams once said, "The jaws of power are always open to devour." The jaws of power are always open to devour. Damn right. And that's what we're talking about. But I don't think it means that they are, I think it means that they are in league, but it's a Venn diagram that kind of overlaps. It's not exactly a connection, but I see what you're getting at, though. I kind of see what you're getting at. Abby wrote on YouTube, why would they be afraid of God's judgment if they're living Christian lives? That's an interesting point. And Nora responded to this. Nora responded to Abby, I am glad that I'm not the only one who sees this. The tension between natural law and specific faith traditions is tricky enough without making it partisan. I think that part of it has to do with your view of what you're supposed to do as a Christian. I mean, the Great Commission in the Bible, Jesus says, go out into all the world, proclaim the gospel, teach them everything I taught you, and baptize them. So depending on how you view your Christian responsibility, you might not think that you can please God unless you are doing it to the utmost, unless you have turned everything on earth into kind of God's dominion. Never mind that that's not your job. Jesus did that, right? Jesus started the framework for that. All we have to do is what Jesus said, if you're a Christian, and then believe that at some point, Jesus will return and that dominion will begin, whether you're here or not. Your job is to love God and love one another. That's what Jesus said. They asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets rest on these two commandments. So Jesus already answered the question. And I think that there is a tremendous gap in the conversation about the political aspect of what Jesus wanted and the theological aspect of what Jesus wanted. Now, everyone's going to read the Bible their own way. I read it my way, you read it yours. But that's a conflict. And I think that we owe it to our country to ask Christian nationalists that question. Like, how do you reconcile all of this? It doesn't make sense to me. It just does not make sense to me. Beyond that, I think there's also a bit of a theological problem here. There's a very big theological problem here. And I don't want to get too deep into this because I am not a preacher, and that will be very apparent. Even though my late grandmother, God rest her soul, believed that at one point I was going to become a preacher. And then I realized that I like boys. But I do know my Bible, and I know my Bible well enough to defend myself from people who want to hit me with that Bible. And there is one verse, if you don't know any Bible verses, there's one verse I would ask you to literally write down. This verse is vital to the conversation about religion in America. It is vital to the conversation about Christian nationalism, so-called Christian nationalism. I don't think there's anything Christian about being nationalistic, but whatever. Not in this nation. I'm telling you, you need to write this verse down. This verse is vital to having this conversation. Here's the verse. It's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. It's in the New Testament. It reads, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Here's the key part. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Can I get an amen? That's the verse that I think begins to kill Christian nationalism as a Jesus-centered theory. It's this idea that you can just pound your way through democracy and rip the country away from secular and non-religious people in a way that comports with the Bible. No, you can't. Because the Bible says the burden of proof is on you, Christian, and that you always need to be ready for it and to do so with gentleness and respect. The Bible says so. So if you call yourself a Christian nationalist, if you believe that the policies of the United States should be in line with the policies of your faith, which I'm not 100% against. Again, the civil rights movement led by black ministers was a theological movement that lined up with the Constitution. So the idea of it's not inherently flawed. You might also have policies like, say, helping the poor and the homeless and the needy, which line up very well with the teachings of Jesus Christ. So it's not just that you can't say, I'm a Christian and I believe you should approve this bill. I'm a Christian and I support that candidate. That's not the issue. The issue is how you make the case. Are you making your case in a way that honors Christ as you call yourself a Christian? Or are you using God as a shield for your own sense of disempowerment, for your own fears about the future of the world, for your own frustration that more people don't think the way you think, for your own bitterness at the fact that you have lived such a chaste, holy, upright, noble life, and people all around you are getting away with being filthy heathens, disobeying God, and none of them seems to be incurring the wrath you were told they would incur, and what is going on, and I'm going to fix this. Is that what you're doing? And you want us to believe you're doing it in Christ's name. Really? You really don't think that we see through it? Because I do. And the sad part of this is, and I think this is where you come in, you watching this right now, I think that because of the politically divisive environment that we are in right now, which some of us have created for ourselves, it feeds that fear. It feeds that belief that Christians are in a holy war, which hopefully, God willing, will not turn into a shooting war, but that there is a kind of a cultural warfare going on between Christians of this ilk and with everybody else that seems to embolden and empower Christian nationalists to go, see, they can't be trusted. They're not going to change. We have to do this ourselves. And we're the generation to do it. And I think it's going to be up to people like you and me to find ways to just go, hey, I'm not your enemy. I would like to hear you out. What do you have to say? Talk to me. You don't have to barrel your way through. I'm not going to let you run over me, but I'll listen. If you got something to say, talk to me. I'm not a bad person. What's on your mind? I think if you want to have friends, you got to show yourself to be friendly. If you want to have love, you got to show yourself to be lovable. If you want to have a democracy, you got to show yourself to be democratic with a small d. You have to show yourself to be willing to model the kind of thoughtfulness and empathy and logic and engagement and civility that you want from other people. Christian nationalists can't do it. They're too wrapped up in other things, but you can. So I don't see any excuse for us not to build that kind of country right this second, because if we don't, then people who are jacked up on religiosity are going to burn this down. And I'm fearful of that. And I don't want to see anyone hurt, including Christian nationalists. I don't want to see Christian nationalists hurt by their own reading of the Bible. I don't want to see otherwise good people fool themselves into thinking that they get to go to war with you when that was not what Jesus called them to do. Jesus called them to do two things: love God and love one another. In other words, love and love. Christian nationalism does not look like love. It just doesn't. And I worry that unless people of all faiths and no faith and weak faith don't find a way to go, hey, breathe, and get together, that this is going to explode in ways that we can't unravel, because what is the point of listening to people who don't see God the way you see it? Now's the time. All else fails. I keep coming back to this. And every time I think about Christian nationalism, I'm going to check the chat and we'll do this one more time before I move on to the next thing. And I swear I'm moving on to the next thing. I know this is a deep dive, and I really appreciate you sticking around for this. I think a lot of folks may have been like, this is too deep, I'm out. But thank you for this. There's one verse that you already know it, that always comes up for me when I think about the issue of Christian nationalism. And it's a Bible story, and it's a story you already know. And again, I'm no preacher, but it's a story that I think we just need to keep in mind because it's in the book. You just may not know where in the book it comes from. But it comes from John, the book of John, one of the 4 Gospels, in the 8th chapter. It's the very beginning of chapter 8 in the Bible. Chapter 8 is actually kind of a big one. A lot of phrases that there are a number of phrases that we're associating with Jesus that come from John chapter 8. If you ever heard, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free, that's John 8:32. There's another one that comes from John 8 that's, I think, important. I'll read it from the New International. And again, sorry for being preachy, but this is now a political matter. Says chapter 8, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Pause right there. If Jesus says, yeah, I guess you got to kill her, then his ministry is screwed. If Jesus says, no, don't kill her, then he's advocating breaking the law, and he is screwed. So what does he do? Brilliant. John 8, back to verse 6. Jesus bent down, and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning them, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Pause again. I've heard that some scholars believe, although it's not written in the story, but some believe that he was writing out their sins on the ground, the sins of the mob that brought the woman, and was just on the dirt, just writing it out. Like, okay, you can go for her, but then we have to go for you, because I know what you did last summer, and spring and winter and fall. So save a pebble for yourself. Sure enough, verse 9, at this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Pause right there. That's it. That's the key. That's why if you are a Christian who considers yourself so furious with the world right now that you just want to see the sword of God come down over all of his enemies, this is the reason that you're wrong. Jesus didn't do that. You claim to be a Christian. How can you be a Christian when you advocate something Jesus opposed? Jesus directly opposed religiosity. He directly opposed religious judgments. What's your excuse? You have none. You have none. Come out of there, please. You don't have to tell me. You don't have to make a big declaration of it. You ain't got to post it on social media. You ain't got to go up to your preacher. You ain't got to say nothing. Just you and God be like, hey, I'm sorry. Can we just not tell anyone that I thought this way? And can I just kind of get on with my life? And if you believe in forgiveness, then get on with your life. But there's nothing scriptural that defends what you're doing. Nothing. Stop hurting people in Jesus' name. Please stop. You've done it to enough people. Some of you did it to me as a little gay kid growing up who is still carrying the weight of judgment at age 43, about to turn 44 in a few weeks. Still. Stop hurting people. Jesus didn't call you to do it. God does not respect it. And you know in your heart of hearts that if someone did the same thing to you, you'd be 10 shades of pissed, rightly so. Come up out of there. You don't need to live that way anymore. You don't need to live that way anymore. Please stop. Please. Pray on it. Think about it. But your country needs you. And we can't use you like this. But the world needs you. The world needs you. Holly, I like the way that you put that. Well, Marilyn, first of all, Marilyn on Facebook says, thank you. Appreciate it, Marilyn. I appreciate that. It worries me. It just, anyway, you know how I feel. Yeah, it just worries me. Holly, I see your comment on YouTube. Holly writes, Peter's advice runs counter to the current baptize him till the bubbles stop principles of Christian nationalism. I'd never heard that phrase. Baptize him till the bubble. Oh, okay. That took me a second. Okay, you don't know how dumb I am, Holly. Can I tell you how dumb I am? You know what I thought you meant when you said bubbles? I thought you meant bubbles like a bubble bath. Like, how God take me away. That was literally the first thing I thought of. I did not think you meant, but you take them and you dunk them on the water, and all you hear is, oh, hey, amen, preacher, amen. Like, I didn't realize that that's what you meant. I baptize you. Do you believe? And all you get is these little bubbles coming up to the surface going, help, help. Like, that took me a second. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. This is what happens when I get on a roll, is my better senses kind of, they get away from me. But anyway, and now that you said it, that's all I'm going to think about when somebody is being baptized. It's just the little bubbles come up going, help. That's what happened to me anyway. So now it makes more sense. Maybe that's why I didn't think of it, because I have repressed the memory of being half drowned as a 7-year-old, but clearly it was all worth it. Clearly it was worth it. We're going to move on in just a second. Thank you for indulging me on this very long journey. I know this took a while, but I'm grateful that you were willing to stick to it. I welcome contrasting points of view. If you think of something later on, go to nightlightjoshua.com, hit the contact me link, and just tell me what you think. You don't have to agree with me, but I feel strongly about this. And if you have a strong point of view on this too, I welcome it. I absolutely welcome it. Still to come, I want to talk about something I saw in Axios about loneliness in the nation's capital. I lived there for 3 years while I was a host on NPR. I want to get into that article, but I don't think it's quite the way they see it, and I wonder if there's a little more to it. As a matter of fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now. So if you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch, you should see the link that I just dropped in. I don't know if you'll be able to click it, because sometimes some of these platforms can be funky like that. But I just dropped the link in. It's from Axios about Washington, D.C. being the loneliest city in the country. I don't know if I buy that, but take a look if you want during the break, and we'll talk about it in a second. Then I will show you a few efforts to reclaim the Black history of parts of the country where African Americans were not only enslaved or made to be low-paid, underserved laborers, but their names may have been lost to history. Their stories are being reclaimed. I want to show you a little bit more about that when we come back. Welcome back. Good to be with you on this Leap Day 2024. Glad to see some of the comments that were in the chat about celebrating leap years. For those of you who have a leap day, birthday, the leaplings among us, happy birthday. We'll see you back in 2028. Good luck until then. But no, you still have birthdays every year. We'll just give you a quarter of a birthday. We'll just say, all we sing to you is happy birthday to you. And then we walk away. That's it. You only get a quarter of the song. And the next year you'll get happy birthday. Wouldn't that be the meanest thing to do to someone born on the 29th, is to sing like a quarter of the birthday song every year and then just walk away and then the party is over. So like in 2027, I would hear happy birthday, dear Joshua. and then you just leave. That would be the meanest thing ever. But there are some noteworthy people with leap year birthdays. Since some of you mentioned it in the chat, I just figured I'd take a look. A few of the famous people who have leap year birthdays, leap day birthdays, include Ja Rule, the hip hop artist, Pedro Sanchez, who is the Prime Minister of Spain, the actor Dennis Farina, Dinah Shore, well-known singer and TV personality, motivational speaker Tony Robbins was born on February 29th, and Pope Paul III was born on February 29th, 1468. And also, I didn't know this. Is this canon? I didn't know this was true. Superman from DC Comics. Is that canon? I need to, hold on a second. I need someone, DC Comics, Superman bio. Is this the truth? He was born on another planet. How do we know what his birthday was? I'm curious. I'm very curious. Origins, history, born on Krypton. We know that part. I don't know. Or is that the date that he landed in the cornfield and was picked up by Martha and Jonathan Clark? See, now I'm fascinated. Now I really want to know whether or not he was actually... I read this from an article in the New York Times just now, and I'm not convinced. Or was that the date of the first Superman comic? Anyway, this has absolutely nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today. But now I really want to know. Now I'm dying to know. If anybody knows, please let me know. But anyway, happy birthday to those of you celebrating a leap day birthday, including the Man of Steel. Let's talk about loneliness. A lot of us are dealing with loneliness right now. Some of us more than others, but I think we need a more thoughtful way to talk about why we are supposedly lonely, and we need better ways to deal with it for everyone's sake. Here's what I'm talking about. There's a piece in Axios that I saw not too long ago, came out just a few days ago, titled "Washingtonians Are Facing a Loneliness Crisis." And it's an interesting take on the way we're looking at loneliness, relationships, connection, and so on. I'm not sure I fully buy the premise. I don't know if I really buy the entire premise, but I do understand where they're coming from. Before I get to that, though, I want to close the loop on the conversation we were just having about Christian nationalism, and then we'll get into loneliness. I just want to make sure I bring this up now before I forget. I told you that I am deeply concerned about the way that Christians are exerting themselves in American society in such heavy-handed ways as Christian nationalism. There are also people of faith who are exerting themselves in ways that they argue are much truer to the actual message and essence of Jesus. You may remember during the Super Bowl that a number of ads ran from a campaign called He Gets Us. And the idea of the He Gets Us campaign is to get people to reacquaint themselves with Jesus and ask themselves how they can be more truly Christ-like in their day-to-day life. Well, I interviewed the executive who oversees the He Gets Us campaign. His name is Jason Vanderground. We had a wonderful conversation, and tomorrow on this program, you will hear the extended conversation between me and Jason Vanderground of He Gets Us. Here is a preview.
We started this campaign, a lot of people said, we should just tell better stories about all the good things that Christians are doing in the world. That will make a difference. Many of the approaches that leaders think are successful are actually not working at all. We think the answer is to not tell a good story about all the good things that I'm doing and how I'm a great guy and how another leader is doing. It's to get back to Jesus. And let's see if that doesn't make a difference in the direction of our country and the way that we treat each other. And we're audacious enough, maybe we're naive enough to think that that's actually possible.
Jason Vanderground, we will play our interview with him tomorrow on the Nightlight at this time. We'll go inside the He Gets Us campaign, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. What will you think of what he has to say about the campaign? I did ask him about the funding for the campaign, about what the campaign's actual goals are, about whether the issue is with the image of Christ or the image of Christians. And they also let me know where their next big advertising drop is going to be. The Super Bowl was not the end of their big ticket advertising moves, nor was it the only thing they did during the Super Bowl in Las Vegas, granted. But I don't know if he committed a little news in terms of our conversation about where their next big ad buy is going to be, but there's going to be a big one, and we talked about it in the interview. So join me tomorrow at this time to hear my full conversation with Jason Vanderground of the He Gets Us campaign here on The Nightlight. Let's talk about loneliness in Washington. The piece out of Axios notes that there are some statistical factors in terms of how DC kind of deals with people in general, I guess. Now, one of the things that it notes is that some people already find it hard to make friends in DC. It's quite transient, very based around political job cycles, high living costs. Also, another factor that I don't think they really mentioned in this piece, it's a university town. A lot of people don't think about Washington that way, but it has a huge number of very big universities. Think about it. Georgetown, George Washington, American University, Howard University, George Mason, the University of the District of Columbia, Catholic University of America, and on and on and on. There are a lot of institutions of higher learning in the DC area where you've got a bunch at the University of Maryland, where you have a lot of people moving in and out constantly. And so I think that also adds very much to the transience of DC. It helps to keep the city feeling really vibrant, though. I really think that that city benefits from having such a mix of politics, government, business, industry, and higher ed that live in a very narrow area with a lot of ambition and a lot of big ideas for how to shape the world. I think that's actually a good thing, in addition to the legacy populations that make up DC. But it also does make the city rather transient. And the city does have higher living costs compared to a number of other places. Granted, you could live across the Potomac in Virginia, where there is no state income tax. DC and Maryland do have local and, in Maryland's case, a state income tax. But still, it's tough. And this piece from Axios cites the lingering effects of things that we all deal with. COVID, for example, remote work. I never would have been able to do this show if the technology did not exist for me to work remotely. But at the same time, like, it gets really lonely doing this kind of work. And it's tough. It's really very tough. The Axios piece notes that almost half of Washington, D.C.'s households consist of one person. Now, to be clear, and Axios notes this rightly, just because you live alone, that doesn't automatically make you lonely, right? Some people don't mind being on their own. Personally, I like my solitude. I like to be around people a lot, but am I the only one who feels like you just need time for like that, for just to just kind of, it's almost like when you're listening to music and you shut it off real quickly and then you realize, oh crap, that was louder than I thought, because the contrast to the silence is so sharp. I get that. I got that today. Bopping around in my kitchen, getting ready, having breakfast, making coffee, and then I shut the music off to come in here, and it was like I had walked into a soundproof booth. I was like, geez, God, that music was loud. I like my solitude. I don't like loneliness. I do struggle with being lonely in a sense of feeling disconnected. That's why I take you and your presence here so seriously. So, more than you will ever know. More than you'll know. But if I'm working, I'm fine being on my own. I'm sometimes better on my own, depending on the task. So I appreciate that the Axios piece notes that living alone does not automatically equate to loneliness, but it is linked to higher rates of depression as people report it for themselves. I think it's kind of logical. It also notes that the federal government has not really set a plan for getting workers back in the office. This is a big factor for a couple of reasons. And I know we like to dump on the federal government. It's bloated, it's too many people, blah, blah, blah. This is an actual issue because every single office in the United States government is a taxpayer expense. And if we don't have a clear plan through the government agencies that run the entire real estate portfolio of the U.S. government, we're spending money that we're not getting value for. We're spending a lot of taxpayer dollars, I suspect, to keep the lights on and the power running and the Wi-Fi working in a lot of buildings where people have not specifically migrated back into the office. So it's not just a matter of, oh, the government's too big. The government is big because America is big. But since we have these spaces, we need to decide what to do with them, and we need to make the best use of them. And that is a huge cost. It can also make it harder to do some of the things that we need to do. For example, some government buildings are dramatically outdated. Number one among them, the FBI. The FBI headquarters, the J. Edgar Hoover building in downtown Washington, D.C., is in desperate need of renovation and replacement. That was one of the things that the Trump administration derailed. They had been looking at sites in a variety of areas, and the Trump administration derailed that process. Now, when we're talking about a real estate magnate derailing a real estate process of the U.S. government, there's all kinds of other issues involved in that. We're not going to get into those. But some of our federal offices really need to be replaced. If there's one building in Washington that you want to be safe, secure, and up to spec, it's the FBI. I think the FBI headquarters would be among them. Sidebar over. Anyway, housing prices remain high. A lot of people live individually. And then some people are choosing to leave for less expensive areas. Highest outmigration rate per capita in this decade is Northern Virginia. That would be the cities, Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax, that sit right up near the Potomac River. Quick, easy access to D.C. One person who lives in Columbia Heights, which is a neighborhood of Washington, D.C., named Michael Sporey, told Axios that you're officially a Washingtonian, quote, when you've had 2 generations of friend groups leave the city. D.C. is hard to make long-term friends because lots of people end up leaving, unquote. They also quote a psychologist named Christina Lee from Kaiser Permanente who says, quote, it's been hard for people to make connections again. There's just this awkwardness in reconnecting, unquote. She says that her patients are overall not as lonely now as they were during COVID, which I think is logical, but they feel more isolated than before, which she says has to do with some of the habits that we picked up in COVID of socializing less, putting off milestones like getting married or having families, and just getting used to connecting virtually like we're doing right now, rather than in person. I think there's some real merit to that. I've been to a number of events that really try to get people to learn how to socialize all over again, if that makes sense, to kind of learn how to talk to one another again. And that can sound a little pathetic, but it's also sort of real, especially because we have a generation now growing up that is so used to being on digital devices and also doing very intensive connective activities like gaming that are entirely remote, that don't work if you're in the same room, that mostly don't work unless you're like esports gaming at a high level, but that usually work just fine when you're in vastly different places. We talked yesterday about the game Helldivers 2, which I'm a huge fan of. That is a remote, online, cooperative game where everyone's playing the same game around the world in groups of 3 or 4, trying to achieve the same mission. So we've kind of crossed that bridge. And I think for a lot of younger people, it's really hard to kind of understand why they need to do anything else, especially because you and I, people my age anyway, and up, are not really teaching them how. I can't blame young adults for feeling awkward because they haven't been taught to work through the brutal discomfort of learning to be social. It's hard. I think some of us take it for granted. I think some of us need to give young adults a break. They're doing the best they can. And we've never quite trained them to socialize. It's not automatic. It's hard. And I think that if you're a young adult who feels like you can't even, I don't blame you. Here's the problem. Your life will miss out on a variety of opportunities if this is not a skill you have. Yes, things are becoming more virtual. You're still dealing with human beings. And genetically, we have not drifted that much in the last 5 years of social media. You still need to know how to talk to people. It's hard, but it's hard for everybody, not just for you. And if no one is reaching out to show you how to do it, you still need to find a way to learn. I'll help if I can, but I wouldn't just presume you don't need it because you don't have it. As my mother always said, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Just a thought. Back to DC. The good thing is that there are some local groups like City Girls Who Walk DC, DC Fray, that are seeing more people show up for events that are looking for meaningful connection and meaningful interaction. That's great. And I'm seeing that happening in a variety of other places. People want to go out. I mean, why do you think theme parks boomed after COVID? Because people wanted to go out and people prefer to be entertained together. We like doing things together. We're social animals. By the numbers, Axios notes that the rate of one-person households in DC is higher than in cities like New York, Chicago, LA, or Atlanta, based on data from the Census Bureau. That is up. It's 49% right now in DC. Back in 2019, it was 45%. In 2012, it was 40%. But that matches a national increase. Latest data show 29% of all U.S. households have just one person. Back in the 60s, it was 14%. And that's all based on census data. So that's going up and up and up. Now, pause right there for a second. When it comes to DC, and I'm going to check your comments in the chat in just one second, but when it comes to DC, I don't know that I feel quite the same way about the whole loneliness argument. I think that one of the things in DC, and for those of you who don't know me except from this program, hello, I'm Joshua. Good to meet you. When I was in DC, I lived there for 3 years. I was the host of an NPR talk show called 1A, which was based out of WAMU in Washington. And when I got there, it was my very first national hosting gig. It was my very first NPR gig. And I was working for a station on NPR. I wasn't working at NPR, just to be clear. But it was a really scary time, terrifying. And I did the best I could to manage my fears with the job, with the political climate. I was there from 2017 to 2019 during the Trump administration, when journalists were constantly being called the enemy of the people, when America was extremely politically intense, and when lots of people really wanted a good, live, connective, non-judgmental, non-partisan space to talk about things that mattered. So when I heard from people, I never had people walk up to me and say, like nobody ever gave me a hard time for being a journalist or whatever. That did not happen to me. But I did get a lot of people who were super intense in their appreciation of what I did. A little too intense sometimes, but generally just gushing over my work. That created more loneliness. I don't think people realize, and how could you? Because it's not a normal thing. But when you have these, they're called parasocial relationships with people, where you know them, but they don't know you. Beyonce has parasocial relationships with her fans. It's almost more isolating. It's like when people lift you up on their shoulders, you get farther and farther away from the people with every layer of fandom. And it just made me feel more isolated. By the time that I left, 1A was being heard by about 4 million people a week. We were a hit. We got on the air at the right time, in the right way, with the right energy, and the nation showed up. We were bumping other similar shows off of NPR stations who took 1A. That's how successful the show was. We grew from our predecessor, the Diane Rehm show, to more stations than she was on when she left the air, to a larger audience. That was the goal. Check. We did all of that. That made DC horribly lonely. Even when I tried to meet people. I remember one night I was at a bar, a gay bar in DC, just hanging out with some friends. And one of my buddies who, he had been tasting, his beak was wet. He was a little socially lubricated. Came up to me and was like, "Josh, I got to introduce you to some friends of mine." It's like, okay, fine. And so we're in this circle of people. And so he starts introducing around. This is Mary, and this is, Susie, and this is Boo Boo, and this is Pinky, and this is Flay Flay, and this is Murgatroyd. And then he gets to me and he goes, "And I'm sure you already know from National Public Radio the host of 1A, Mr. Joshua Johnson. And if I could have imploded, I would have just gone and just disappeared from existence in that moment. The more that he was gushing about my famous, awesome friend, the more it made me feel like I was behind bulletproof glass. Protected by the connection, but also terribly cut off from just feeling alive and feeling connection at all. It's a weird, uncomfortable relationship. And I later told him, if you ever introduce me to people that way again, we will never speak. And he got it. He got the point. But the number of times that I think I experienced a very visceral awareness of my status made it almost impossible for me to be happy in Washington. I was desperately unhappy for the 3 years that I hosted 1A. Not necessarily because of the team. The team at 1A was fantastic. Everyone, from my executive producer, Rupert, to the senior producers, Denise, Danielle, Lindsay, Paige, to all the producers, the associate producers, our engineer, Jake, and everyone was just it was a really good time to be there and great people. But being in a city like Washington, I think sort of concentrates and freeze dries a lot of the malaise that a lot of us feel in the disconnection we have from one another, that it's hard for us to put work down. Indeed, when I was able to socialize in DC, what I got the most out of was being in spaces where people whose names you would know dropped ranks completely. I mean, I went to holiday parties that had a Supreme Court justice who had recently been nominated to the court. I won't call this person's name, but they handed me a Diet Coke when I was looking for one. And there was a news executive over there, and there were a number of people from NPR. I've been to parties that had some people from CNN whose name that you would know, and from CBS whose name that you would know, because those people also needed to connect on a totally human, non-work level. And I think if DC is lonely, it's not lonely because we're lonely. I think DC is lonely because it's always in the spotlight, because it gets too much attention. I think DC is too important to be home. DC is a working city. Very few people call Washington home. Washington may be where you live, but very few people are Washingtonians. Many of them are Black. Many of them are low income. Many of them do absolutely nothing related to politics, government, business, media, or education. And they're wonderful people. They are not the bulk of who you meet. I mean, how can you feel quite at home when your home is across the street from the Chinese embassy, which my home was? I mean, just over a few blocks over. We're over there. I think that's what the real issue is in here. And I don't think that this piece from Axios reflects that. I don't think DC is lonely because of the factors that you see on paper. I think it's lonely for reasons that we haven't talked about. And we don't talk about it as Americans either. What is it like being an influencer on social media? How lonely is that when you realize, oh my God, people think they know me? What is it like being a parent who's got kids and a spouse and maybe a loved one you're caring for, maybe an aging parent, where all of a sudden you have to be Superman or Superwoman and you don't know a lot of other people who can relate to what you're dealing with? Or even being a single parent. I was raised by a single mom. What's that like? What kind of loneliness do you feel politically when you maybe are a conservative in a very blue community, or progressive in a very red community, and you just don't have anyone you can reach out to and don't feel safe even broaching the subject? What's that like? I think our conversation on loneliness needs to evolve a lot for it to be useful, to not be quite so quantitative like Axios has done, and be way more qualitative about what our lives are individually like, because we befriend one another as individuals. That's exactly why if you were white and said, I need more Black friends, your Black friends would be like, freeze. You don't need more black friends. You need more friends who are black. There's a very different thing. You're not just going to like go to Safeway and go, that one. Like, that's not the way that this works. You need to connect with people as people and then work your way backwards. Does that make sense? I think that's part of the problem with the way we're talking about this. But I think there are some efforts to try to figure out what we can do in a smarter way to have these kinds of conversations. Let me look at the chat and just see some of your comments before we keep going. Irish Rover, I saw your comments on YouTube. Irish Rover writes, I'm a super introvert. I like the calm and quiet. I can deal with the public for about 2 to 3 hours before I am worn out and need to return home to recharge, LOL. I just don't want to be forced to go into an office just so you can justify paying your office lease. I hear you on all of the above. I also hear you in terms of paying the office lease. I totally get that. I think a lot of companies are going to find that they need less office space than they have in a way that could be nice for, say, for someone like me in the long run. If, say, the nightlight continues to be a going concern and if I remain an independent business person, eventually I'd like to get the hell out of my bedroom and go into an honest-to-God office and build a studio. And I think once you have more of these big companies who decide we don't really need studio space or we don't really need office space, in some places, it might get easier for me to get the kind of space that I want when they have to kind of grapple with the fact that the market has shifted and the cost structure has to shift too, especially for people like me who work very lean, aka alone. So that may actually be a good thing. I hear you in terms of needing recharge. And I think that these devices, these phones that we have and these watches that beep and buzz and buzz all the time, they're exhausting. They're just a lot. And I think sometimes we need to turn all that stuff off and allow ourselves to twitch just for a few minutes. You ever have that feeling where like, my watch just vibrated, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to be a good example. You ever have that feeling where you like, you hear your phone go, it's just on a table. And you're looking over here, you're kind of, and then you hear it and you immediately grab for it. Have you ever tried to just kind of not grab for it? You'll hear the phone. I'm not going to touch it. I don't care. I'm fine. I'm doing work. It's not that and you know it's Instagram. You know it's nothing necessary. And you really have to force yourself not to even look at it, not to engage with it, and you're trying not to lose your mind. That thing I think speaks to our need for connection. That's why that works. Because you know that beep, buzz, bing, ding, whatever it is, means that something has happened out there that you can connect to. So I don't think the impulse is bad, but I think the way that it hits us sometimes just sucks. And it's hard to kind of manage. And I think sometimes we need more of an understanding of like peace and quiet. And I think that's going to be healthy. We'll talk, I'm trying to book a guest to talk about that, about the need for kind of solitude and how we deal with that, the line between solitude and loneliness, which I think is a clear line. Maybe we'll come back to that at some point. Holly wrote on YouTube, my improv theater had a lot of people taking 101 classes as we came out of COVID so they could relearn eye contact. Whoa, that is wild. Really? That is so that's fascinating. I would love to know what that was like for them. I totally get it. Like I used to teach improv, or I ran an improv session when I was in college. So I know the value of improvisational theater, but like, wow, that's such oh God, I'm fascinated. I'm so fascinated now. Going to take an improv class so you can learn to be just kind of present with people and learn to work off of people instead of work against people is remarkable. I am absolutely fascinated. That's fascinating. I find that really fascinating. Christy on Facebook. Hello, Christy. Thank you for being with us today. Christy wrote on Facebook, I've lived in 10 states and Canada. I've ventured to connect with each move. Now that I live in North Dakota, I don't fit into the established groups, friends, etc. They're not welcoming to new residents. Partly, I never had relatives from here, etc., etc. It doesn't matter to me anymore. Christy, I appreciate you sharing that. I also appreciate you noting that you listen to me on 1A and love the show. Thank you for that. That means a lot. I'm glad you shared that with us. That's hard. I'm really sorry that that's been your experience. I think a lot of people who live in the Dakotas, in Wyoming, in Montana, and in Idaho, to varying degrees, have seen a significant population boom, partly because of COVID, partly because people could move, wanted to move, needed to be someplace else, and also because some of those regions of the country in the last few years have boomed in terms of energy exploration. Oil and natural gas, fracking, has brought a lot of jobs to some of those areas. And with it came a bunch of people who have moved in that were not kind of the typical North Dakotans or South Dakotans. And that's fine. But I also understand, this influx of people and like, who are these folks and our way of life and blah, blah, blah. So I can imagine it is tough. I also struggled to fit in New York, but that's partly because of just kind of the issues I had with DC, like moving to a city that you move to for a career. That's why when we moved west to Las Vegas from New York, where I lived before this, my partner and I have realized we really dig it out here. We like the West Coast a lot. People move to New York to build a career. People move to California to build a life. And it's a very different set of motivations. I think people move to Washington to build a career as well. And that might make it very hard for people to connect in a variety of ways because they're not looking for connection as much as they are looking for advancement. And I'm not knocking advancement. I want advancement. I still want career advancement in my industry, not just as an independent. So I get that. But at the same time, I think a lot of us who make those moves, I certainly did not think this through enough at all. Did not think about how much I needed that community that I had in San Francisco before I moved to Washington and how much it would irrevocably break when I moved. Those people still know me, we still care about me, but it ain't the same. And there's nothing in DC that rivals that. So I'm sorry that you've really struggled with that. I think that's real. I think that's a real thing, and I don't know what the remedy for that is. I think sometimes you just got to kind of go where you know that you're at home. Vegas feels like a good place to live. I don't know if this is as much home to me as California certainly was. Even on our trip to Palm Springs that we took this past weekend, that was really hard driving back. I was like, oh my God, I love it here. I want to go back home. And it just made it very clear to me that Vegas is not home. At least not yet. Lovely people. This is a great city. Vegas is a great city to live in. There's a lot going on. There's opportunities here. There is a booming population here. I think it's a gem that not enough people take seriously as a place to build a home. Schools need work. Healthcare needs work. So there are some structural issues to building a longer life here in Vegas that the city and the county and the state need to figure out. So if you're planning to put your kid in public school, that's another matter. Do some research because the Clark County School District is in drama right now. But just as a place where you can kind of connect and meet cool people, yeah, this is not a bad place. I appreciate those of you who wrote and liked 1A. Abby, I appreciate you and your kind words about 1A and the legacy of the Diane Rehm Show and my work back to WLRN. Gosh, that was forever ago. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I do want to note one thing before I move on. Actually, two. Sarah wrote on YouTube, your phone has gas. Is that what it sounds like? Well, did it sound like I was tooting? Did it sound like is that the tooting? Is that the... I don't think that's gas. I think that is a very different kind of a vibrating sound. I've got a couple of them. I can do that's the phone vibrate, and then there's the, which is the racing car, and then there's the toot sound, which I'm not going to do because this is a fine program of esteemed quality, and I wouldn't debase myself such. But is that what that sounds like? I thought it sounded a little bit more normal than that, but okay. I guess it does. Maybe a little bit. I don't know. Maybe just slightly. There's one other thing that I wanted to note about DC. Oh, I'm sorry. I also want to talk about the National Strategy for Connection Act that Senator Chris Murphy put forward. And I want to get to one more thing about DC. But before we do that, I want to take a quick break. When we come back, I will wrap up this particular segment and then move on to a few Black history items that I found pretty interesting that I think you should know about, because we can't talk about it come tomorrow. We can only talk about it in February. But I did want to show you a few stories about efforts to reclaim Black history in places where they definitely need to be talked about. One involves a Civil War battlefield in Mississippi. One of them involves a state capitol in the South. And one of them involves Monticello, the estate of Thomas Jefferson. I did not know some of his slaves were photographed. I'll show you before we go. Let's wrap up our conversation about loneliness and then move on to one more thing before I let you go today. Appreciate your patience and your endurance through today's program. I did want to note that there are some efforts, and the Axios piece does mention some of them, that there are actually bills to try to deal with social isolation and loneliness. This is not entirely unique. It's certainly not unique to the US. There have been efforts in the UK to deal with loneliness, particularly among seniors. Some of the bills that the Axios piece noted are the SILO Act, the Addressing Social Isolation and Loneliness in Older Adults Act, SILO, the Improving Measurements for Loneliness and Isolation Act, and one from Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut called the National Strategy for Social Connection Act. If you take a look at the one sheet that Senator Murphy's office put out about his proposal, it references the fact that the Surgeon General of the U.S. recently declared that loneliness and isolation are an epidemic in the United States, meaning that there are real, known, tangible, not just in your head health effects from loneliness and isolation. This is a huge point. If you feel like you are so lonely and so isolated that it's just crushing you, that it makes you literally feel worse, you're probably correct. You are not crazy, weak, or whining. Your body is telling you something. Don't ignore that. Please listen to that. You don't have to deal with that by yourself. You shouldn't. And you should seek out something. Go to the movies. Go to an event at your local library. Go to anything. It doesn't matter what it is. Just go. Go someplace you've never been with people you don't know and do a thing you've never done. Just pick one. It doesn't matter what it is. Pick one and then thank the organizer for it and just chat them up for 45 seconds. Just try it. It doesn't have to be grandiose, just to break the pattern of being all alone. Please don't ignore that. Please don't ignore that. The National Strategy for Social Connection Act from Senator Murphy's office, and again, I'm not endorsing this bill. This is just one of the items, just to give you a sense of what some lawmakers are thinking about. One of the things it would do is establish an executive office within the presidency of social connection policy. I think this is an interesting idea. It would, and this is according to the statement, advise the president on loneliness and isolation and how these issues relate to the economy, public health, national security, the environment, and civic and community engagement. Pause right there. I think there's one other aspect of this that if this is going to be useful, Senator Murphy, if you're listening, you need to add, and that's national identity. Americans, many of us, believe in a kind of rugged individualism, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, that if we ask for help is compromised. There are a lot of people who believe that their loneliness is actually just a side effect of their individualism. I think if we're going to have this conversation, we have to have it in a way that addresses that old cowboy pioneer notion of America's past to build a smarter future. Just because some people crossed the plains alone doesn't mean they wanted us to. But unless we talk about that, I don't know how we get past that mentality. Senator Murphy's bill would also create a government-wide strategy to integrate social connection policy across federal departments and agencies, improve public education and awareness on social connection, kind of the way that we have guidelines on things like nutrition and sleep and physical activity. And it would also support research on these things. I think one of the other areas of pushback that he might encounter has to do with some of the reasons why people feel social isolation. When I was young, I felt social isolation because I'm gay and the kids around me were straight. There's going to be some cultural pushback to that. I think people who are trans are going to need some support in terms of social isolation and loneliness. People who are of different religious backgrounds, people who have different veteran statuses, they also probably feel this. So that could work in favor of ideas like this. But I think if we want to talk about loneliness from both a human and a national perspective, it could be a bit challenging. But there's an effort, at least. They're trying to do a thing. Whether the thing will be done, we shall see. One more thing before I move on to the last part of the show. I did want to note, since we were talking about Washington, something that has been a controversy for the last week or so, going on at least a week. As I mentioned, I used to work for WAMU, which is the NPR news station in Washington, D.C. The other station, WETA, plays mostly classical music, and they're the home of the PBS NewsHour. WAMU is the station that produced 1A, which is the national program that I originated there for NPR. I left the station in 2019 to pursue work on MSNBC and later NBC News. In the last few weeks, WAMU announced an array of layoffs, about 15 layoffs of members of the staff. They also shut down a website called DCist, which was a local news website. A few years ago, 3 NPR stations made what I thought was a brilliant move to buy DCist in Washington, Gothamist in New York, and LAist in Los Angeles. LAist is now owned by KPCC's Public Radio, which changed its name to LAist. Gothamist is owned by WNYC in New York Public Media. DCist is owned by WAMU. Well, AMU decided that they were going to shut down DCist, supposedly to redirect the resources toward more audio programming. But they also laid off a number of people at DCist. So the way they're going to do that seems unclear. The process of announcing this to the staff on the Friday that it came down was very controversial. They reportedly shut access off to the newsroom systems. They kind of froze people out for a while. They had some people remain at home and watch the meeting virtually instead of in the community room on the lower level of WAMU's headquarters in Northwest DC, which I remember we did a whole lot during my time at WAMU when I was there for 1A. And the worst part of it was that the station shut down DCist.org. They just turned off the website so that if you were a reporter who worked for DCist and you were going to start looking for new work, you could not provide links to your clips for future employers. It was like DCist went away and the station shut it off. It redirected to WAMU.org. That prompted a significant outcry from a number of people, including local officials. One of them is NPR's Scott Simon, the longtime host of Weekend Edition Sunday. Scott Simon tweeted or wrote on X, "I want to join at SAG-AFTRA members." WAMU's employees are represented by the union SAG-AFTRA. "I want to join at SAG-AFTRA members to implore our colleagues at WAMU 88.5 to keep archives of DCist online. It is the work of talented journalists. It is part of history. It does not serve the public to just disappear." And a number of people commented using the hashtag #UnlockDCist. A variety of local officials. There was a cover of the local paper called The Express. The cover of it says, WAMU 88.5, hope you enjoy our stinking pivot to audio, in quotes. I don't think that's a direct quote to anybody, but I understand why they did it. But there were a lot of people who really called out why this is important. Kelsey Proud, who is one of my former colleagues at WAMU, wrote, "Something I loved about working in the at WAMU 88.5 at DCist newsroom was the dedication of my colleagues to get to the heart of the matter in their work, making clear what was at stake. They do it again here. Plainly, democracy is at stake. This is not difficult. Hashtag unlock DCist now." The weird thing about Washington, and I think another reason why Washington feels so damn lonely sometimes, is because it's hard to have what we in public media called a sense of place. Basically, if you were an alien and you landed in a particular city and you were wondering what was important to people, you should be able to turn on your public radio station or read your nonprofit news outlets and in a flash get a sense of what people were talking about, thinking about, what was important. It's a sense of place. And for all of the media in Washington, nearly all of it is aimed squarely at the White House, Congress, and the Supreme Court. Very little aims at Washingtonians themselves. That is why there's no sense of place. That is why we're lonely in D.C. And DCist was one of the very few places where you could get smart, sharp, clear, consistent, creative coverage of the region we call the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia. It made you feel like you were at home. WAMU's stated mission is connecting Washingtonians to each other and the world. I supported that mission 100%. Even as a national host, I always sang the praises of WAMU. I made it clear when I wrote the first draft of our script template. Every episode ended with, "This program comes to you from WAMU, a service of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR." We always made it clear that 1A came from Washingtonians, not from a network. It came from a community of people who built something for themselves as a service to the world. And now we have to ask nicely, and we have to go through the rigmarole to get WAMU to put DCist back online, and only for a year? They finally announced they would do that as they look for a home for the site. That's a betrayal. That's a betrayal. We can't have that. Look, I don't work there anymore, and maybe you don't care about this. I could be talking to you about something that has nothing to do with your lives, but we've talked about how local news is in danger. But I think that worse than the loss of information is the loss of connection. And any of the institutions that connect us, that give us a sense of place, that give us a sense of meaning for where we are at a time when everyone's wondering, where are we going? Literally is life-saving. It's ennobling. It's healing. To know that you're not alone and that someone else deems the issues that affect you important enough to cover. That humanizes you. That gives you a presence and a gravitational pull in the world. And every single time one of those sacred spaces falls away, we lose a little something of ourselves. I have no pull over what WAMU does. But I will say this. I am ashamed of the way that the station has dealt with this. I think it is short-sighted. I think it's damnable. But I don't think it's irreversible. I think WAMU needs to work right now to create a restricted fund for local journalism so that there's money for these tasks that is earmarked. It's not hard. It's not unusual. I would call upon Erica Pulley-Hayes, who's the general manager of WAMU, Sylvia Burwell, who's the president of American University, which owns WAMU, and the appropriate officials thereunder to just work on creating a fund and then put it out to the community. Okay, you said you wanted DCist to live. Put your money where your mouth is. Help us fundraise for this. We want to do this. Help us. I think that's the way you rebuild trust here. Is you listen to the community and say, okay, well, let's fix this. Let's solve this problem. Maybe DCist is gone, but you got to have the money to do the next thing. And money is the least of all virtues. There's money everywhere. Someone's got the money to do this. So what are you waiting for? I don't know what's taking WAMU so long to announce its next effort that people can be involved in to fix this problem. Don't make me come back to Washington Don't make me show back up to be the loud, obnoxious guy that you know I can be for things that are important. This is important. Community matters. Washington is your home. And you're just not going to serve it to the best of your ability without telling them what the plan is to move forward? Tempus fugit. What are you waiting on? WAMU needs to announce a plan for the future of local coverage with dedicated funding right away. I'll help. I'd be honored to help. I'll record underwriting spots. I'll come to DC on my own dime just to see that this gets done. But I'm calling on you, the leaders of WAMU, don't drop this ball. My team built a national hit show so that you could have a more secure future, despite COVID, despite the political climate, despite a changing economy, all of that. We did that work. Do not break what we built. I will come to DC, and I'm happy to help. Fix this. I am at your service. Don't break what we built. In the meantime, should you want to make your voice heard, I would encourage you, and this may sound crazy, to become a member of WAMU or your local station. You can go to WAMU.org, click on the donate link, become a member, give a monthly donation, a one-time donation. You don't have to take a gift. If you don't, then the entire value of your donation goes to the station. And usually when you make a contribution to the station, you can also include a note to the station to let them know what it is that's important to you about giving to WAMU. So I would encourage you, if this is important to you, become a member and use that as leverage to send a message about what matters to you. If it matters to you, put your money where your mouth is. Send a message. Tell them, don't break what we built. Support WAMU or support your local NPR member station. Don't let them break what we built. Black History Month. One more thing. I did want to show you a few things. You know what? Actually, I'm going to leave that for tomorrow. Partly because my brow is now furrowed with sweat. And I would like to step down and calm down. I did not expect to preach today, but that is important to me. That is something that I am not okay with. And Holly, I agree with you. Holly writes, public media is a community service. It needs to service its community. Damn right. Damn right about that. I think that community service is vital. And I think that it is not being, I don't know what WAMU's plans are, but we need to know. You got to give people a choice. It's an old rule of sales. You give people a choice between something and something, never between something and nothing. And right now they've given us a choice between something and nothing. What's the next something? That's all I'm talking about. Anyway, let's save the conversation about Black History Month for tomorrow. It's just a brief little mention, and what the hell? It's going to be March. What a maverick thing to do, talking about Black History Month in March. What happens next? We talk about Black history year-round? Anyway, I'm glad that you made time to talk about all of these things with me. Remember to go to nightlightjoshua.com to follow me online. Tonight, we're going to repeat the program live from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern to get people used to following the show in the evening. It's the exact same program, so you won't miss anything. And remember, tomorrow, our interview with the executive from the He Gets Us campaign. I look forward to spending time with you then, but until we meet again, this is Joshua Johnson saying thank you very much for making time for me. And as always, my friends, keep on shining, because someone, somewhere, needs your light right now.